Set that phrase.
All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat
All right. We are starting Deuteronomy today. Yay! I'm excited. I think Deuteronomy is my second favorite book of the Torah. Leviticus will always be my favorite, but I think Deuteronomy is my second favorite. But actually, Deuteronomy is basically Leviticus part 2. So it's the reiterated Leviticus. So we're just doing Leviticus again. Yay! Nobody else is maybe as excited about that. Maybe no one else sees it that way.
So I view it as Moses' last will and testament.
Yes, it is very much. So that's actually my first question is actually like what comes to mind when you think of. I like to do like kind of an intro to the book when we start a new book. If I'm the one teaching, and I am, so here we are. My first question is kind of like what comes to mind when you think of Deuteronomy. I heard a couple people saying that it was their favorite or they really liked it. So what comes to mind when you think of Deuteronomy?
A long sermon.
A long sermon, yes, definitely.
There's tradition that Moses did the entire book in one sitting.
Yes.
Until he dies, and then, of course, Orthodox says that he wrote even the rest of it.
Right. Yeah.
But I just think of it as a constitution. It's kind of like this is what God has given us.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah.
Follow it. But if you don't, these are could be
right.
You can choose life. You can choose death.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kind of the same thing, repeated instructions, how to get it right.
Yes.
What will happen if you don't.
They say this was given like 37 days before he died, so I like the last will and testament. It's like he's reviewing the entire journey from the beginning. He's hitting the highlights. It's not a full, recapping of everything, but the highlights. But the laws, very important, very prominent place, and reiterating the laws. And I thought it was interesting. There's a note here that says the sages refer to Deuteronomy as the Mishneh Torah. So that's the repeating of the Torah.
Yeah, I definitely think of it as like, okay, if there's a new generation that might not like put it in the context of everything that's happened, and it's important to have that as you, and like because it reminds me of me, like I need to be reminded of things. Like if that happened 20 years ago, I probably won't remember.
Yeah. That's good. I like the reminder. That's good. Lori?
Well, I have big thoughts on this, so I'm going to condense them down. I view it as, like I said, last will and testament, but he's walked through this really hard thing with these kids' parents, right? And so, if you have disgruntled parents who might be telling the story one way, so I kind of feel like his retelling is to get the story straight with the second generation, and also it kind of to me shows like what were the main points on his heart about the last 40 years, the stuff that he drills in that like was really on his heart that had to get straight for this group, because there was a lot he doesn't repeat in Deuteronomy. So to me it's like, what did Moses want to make sure was clear and straight before he died?
Yeah.
Is kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, and there are also a few kind of new things, which is really interesting in Deuteronomy. And a lot of times the speculation about why that is because it has to do with with actually being in the land. It's like some of these things only apply if you're in the land, and so you kind of wait until they're about to actually enter the land to kind of give some of those instructions. But it is interesting, we have a little bit of new information. But and some of the retellings are a little bit different than the previous tellings of them, which we have a couple of those in this week's portion, so we'll talk about a little bit about those. I like this. It is very much like, and Dennis Prager's commentary also kind of refers to Deuteronomy as Moses' last will and testament. So I liked that too. It very much feels like, I kind of feel like Moses, as I read it, I kind of feel like Moses is like, I need you to remember this. I need you to not forget where we've come from. And as like the second generation is getting ready to go in, he's like, don't make the same mistakes your parents did. You know, learn from the mistakes. Remember that God is with you. All these things that you can trust Him. Follow Joshua. Follow Caleb. Follow. You know, he's like, it's like I don't know, like a parent sending their kids off into the world or something almost.
Yeah.
A little bit. But I do really enjoy Deuteronomy. So something I found really interesting as I was kind of looking at the transition and reading a few things about kind of the transition from Numbers to Deuteronomy. What I found really interesting was this perspective, because like I already mentioned, we have some retellings of some stories that are a little bit told a bit differently than they were originally recounted earlier, particularly in Numbers. And one of the perspectives that I was reading was basically like Numbers really focuses, if you think about Numbers and you think about even the rebellions or the scouts going to check out the land, it very much focuses on the leadership. Because like thinking about the scouts going into the land, it lists the 12. It's not just 12 random people. It's they refer to them as princes several times. You know, they're prominent leaders or whatever the language is in each specific case. But there's leadership language, and so it's like these prominent people that are going in, and we'll see a little bit differently that Deuteronomy talks about a little bit more generally in terms of the people as a whole. And also like the rebellion of Korah is about leadership, and with the Midianites and the Midianite women and seducing the men and things like that, it's the leaders that are killed, like that are brought before and killed. And so so Numbers very much has this leadership focus, whereas Deuteronomy is very much an all the people kind of telling or regard. So and it also has this Deuteronomy also does have this very like corporate and individual. It's hard to see it in English translations sometimes, but many times the commentators will note that there's kind of a lot of switching back and forth between the singular and the plural you, which in English is sometimes difficult to see. But in the Hebrew you can see it a little bit more clearly. But so there is very much this individual responsibility as well as corporate responsibility being communicated throughout Deuteronomy. But yeah, and so we do get a timestamp here at the very beginning of Deuteronomy 1 so in verse 3, let's say 3, yes. Verse 3, now Moses spoke to Bnei Israel according to all Adonai had commanded for them in the 40th year in the 11th month on the first day of the month. So this is like right up to the end of their wilderness period that he's giving this. And yes, there is tradition that he gave it all at once. I don't know if he really did or not. I don't know if it really matters, but regardless, he gave it right at the end. Even if it took several days, it doesn't really matter. It was given in a at least probably a fairly short amount of time, because it's right before they're going to enter the land and he's going to die. So it very much, I think that's partially why I have this feeling of like, it's a little bit like he's, sending his kid off to college, like, don't forget all these things I've taught you and all these things the Lord has said before you kind of go off into this next adventure and this next stage of life. And he also doesn't always share, we see a couple instances of this even in our opening chapters. He doesn't always share in a perfectly linear way, which is true actually of a lot of the Torah and a lot of the Bible as a whole, and even carries on into the Gospels. Like sometimes you'll see things in different orders in the Gospels, and it's because they're not so concerned with a strict chronology. They're telling a story and trying to make a point, so sometimes, different Gospels group different stories together, which doesn't mean they're not all accurate, it just means they're telling the stories in a different way, right? Which is very similar to like, if Amanda and I were going to each both tell you a story about being in the same place in Ireland, we're going to tell it to you differently, even if we were together the whole time, right? Everybody has different perspectives and different things are highlighted about experiences. And
That's actually, sorry, in a minute.
No, go
That's
ahead.
actually one of the ways that like investigators can tell
Yes.
if witness
Right.
testimony is true or not. Like if eyewitness testimony, like if everybody says the exact same thing, then they know it's made up.
Right. Yeah. I actually think. Yeah. I think about some of like like if you watch like crime investigation type shows, like they'll often show that interrogation. You'll see the the cops or the detectives or whoever's investigating, and they'll be like, we talked to all these people and they said the exact same words in the exact same order. Like this can't be true. Somebody's lying. So yeah. So I think of some of that too. But anyway, so sometimes the differences, or sometimes the different telling that we see, because this is very much Moses speaking, which we've talked about before. Like Moses is like God to the people. So Moses is speaking. He's unique in the sense that when he speaks to the people, it is very often as if the Lord is speaking to the people. But this is in a lot of Deuteronomy, it is very much kind of his telling. And in a similar way that, like we've talked about the kind of the mountain structure of the Torah before. So we've gone all the way up and we're coming back to the base of the mountain. So Deuteronomy and Genesis have some parallels, whereas Genesis sets up kind of the history of humanity, and we have lots of broad tellings of things, and we have a lot of details that are missing, and we have thousands of years that are covered in a couple of chapters and things like that. Deuteronomy sometimes is also giving more broad language to things, and like I said, telling stories, whereas before we're told about specific people and specifically focusing on leadership, he's now focusing on a more corporate reality. So we've kind of come back to looking at all of humanity, if that kind of makes sense a little bit. So anyway, it's a really fascinating book and a fascinating journey, but I'll just say, so he's not always necessarily sharing, right, in a linear, he's not saying, on day 1 in the wilderness we did this, and on day 2 we did this, and then on day 37 we did this, and in year 15 you did this. And, it's not that kind of history, right? So we in that sense, it kind of lets us off the hook a little bit. We don't have to worry about figuring out what some of these details and how they're in different orders. And again, like just to reiterate, like he's also sharing, in some sense, he's sharing his perspective on some of these events, which is sometimes is even like over time how you remember things and the details that you remember shift a little bit. So I think we see some of that, which doesn't mean that it's not accurate and it's not helpful and it's not important, but it does. But we are kind of getting, in some instances, a different kind of perspective on it. And I really like, I've mentioned this book before, and I know Lori at least has it. I think Amanda might have it now too. The Torah Story is a really, really good book. It's not a cheap book, but it's a really, really good book on the Torah. It's kind of a textbook on the Torah, and I really, really like a lot of the comments they make about Deuteronomy. And one of the things they talk about a lot is the motivation behind it. So that Deuteronomy, because we talked about it, it's Moses really talking to the second generation, right? Because at this point, really the first generation, except for Joshua and Caleb and Moses, even Aaron and Miriam, I think, have already died, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, did they both die? Yes, they did. Sorry, got lost in my mind a little bit. So all we have left of the original generation, right, is Moses, who's about to die, and Joshua and Caleb. So everyone else is second generation. So depending on where in the wilderness time frame they were born, some of them are quite young, and some of them are a little bit older because they might be close to 40 or whatever. But he's really talking to the next generation, and so it's kind of like he's trying. Some of this is like he's kind of exhorting them into obedience, and he's trying to encourage. He's kind of explaining the Torah, and sometimes Deuteronomy is referred to similar to the comment about Mishnah Torah. It's Deuteronomy is kind of referred to as Torah within the Torah, because it is this retelling of a lot of aspects of the Torah that we've already seen. And it talks a lot about it's motivating based on this redemptive narrative. So there's a lot of focus on the ways that the Lord has been faithful, and sometimes how the people, the retellings of the rebellions and the unfaithfulness of the people are also present to show the contrast of that. But it's meant to show this redemptive narrative and this redemption that leads to obedience. That obedience doesn't really lead to. I like that this is from the Torah Story. they say that redemption leads to obedience, not the other way around. And I really like that, because I think we see this, like I've mentioned before, I kind of see the wilderness years as very much this like building trust, building relationship between the people of Israel and the Lord as they've come out of slavery and they're breaking that slavery mindset. So there's kind of a growing maturity that's supposed to be happening as they're learning to trust the Lord and be led by the Lord in the wilderness. And I think he does that by these, like, he brings redemption, does some of these miracles, even from, going through the sea and providing food and water for them in the wilderness, and their shoes are not wearing out, and their clothes are not wearing out, and all these things. To show that he's faithful, to help encourage their obedience. He doesn't wait for them to be obedient before he does those things in that sense. And at the same time, obedience is what builds trust and relationship with the Lord. So both are necessary. But it's definitely true that the Lord does not withhold redemption or miracles until the obedience happens, which is good news for us. So that's one of the things I like to see coming out here as well. Just one more comment on obedience, and we'll get into the portion itself here. This is another quote from the Torah story. It says, "The obedience that is not based on the love of God is no obedience at all. It is hypocrisy. The command to love God is a cause of obedience, but it is also caused. While love God comes before the kind of obedience that brings life and blessing, something comes before loving God, a work of the Lord in the heart." So this really comes back to this motivation piece also, is that they are commanded to love God, but really they need the Lord's help to be able to love him back in some sense, which I think is still true of us. There was a Bible study series that came out, I don't know, years and years ago, probably 20 years ago, that was about Deuteronomy. It was called The Law of Love, and I always have thought about, I actually didn't end up doing that study, but I just always remember the title of it, The Law of Love. And just keeping that in mind, and like this idea that, we've talked about before, and I know we've come away from this, especially in this congregation, of this idea that the God of the Old Testament is, full of wrath, and the God of the New Testament is full of love. That's not really true. We see a very loving God throughout the Torah. I don't think I have to make that argument to the people in this room, but just really even seeing, like, sometimes recalling the shortcomings is still being loving of the Lord, right? It's, one of the things that Dennis Prager talks about a lot throughout his commentaries is this, he brings in these parenting examples. It's like, right, like good parents don't, like loving parents don't just let their kids do whatever they want with no consequence and with all these things. And so that's the same thing with God. But but it also goes back to this heart motivation, which is something that we see as I think is kind of the eternal wrestle throughout the rest of the Bible, and I think throughout the rest of humanity, of this, what is your motivation for obedience? Is it loving God? Like, because there's passages later, there's Psalms later, there's, Isaiah talks about it, as even with the examples of the sacrifices. It's like, if you bring the sacrifices but you don't love God, or you don't have this right heart posture towards it, he doesn't care. It doesn't matter. He's like, basically, this is the Emma translation, but it's like, he's basically saying, like, if you don't love me, I don't care if you sacrifice, right? Like, because it doesn't mean anything. And so, even Yeshua's rebuking the Pharisees, who theologically he actually agrees with many times, is about their heart posture. And he's like, you're standing out here trying, making a show of your obedience, but do you actually love God? So really, I think a main point and a main thing about this is he's talking about obedience. He's talking about following the instruction of the Lord, but he's also talking about loving the Lord. And so I think that's an important aspect to this too. As we're reading through, Moses is really not just exhorting them to be obedient for obedience sake. He's encouraging them to be obedient because God has been good to them. And because of the love that God has shown to them and how he has led them, that this love, their way of showing love back in some sense is this obedience and this living by his instructions, and so that they can receive the blessing that he promises, which we have a lot of those later on in Deuteronomy, these blessing and curse passages that are really, really powerful. And so like we already talked about, like this is very much an exhortation to the next generation. And I don't actually even remember what commentary I read this in. No, I think it's from the Torah story. But they talk about this, kind of almost the measure of quote unquote success of a generation is what the next generation looks like. And so talking about like actually the success of the wilderness generation is if the second generation is faithful and obedient and devoted to the Lord. So sometimes, the warning is that sometimes we can think so much about our own self, our own sanctification, our own relationship with the Lord, that we cannot think about, how it's impacting the next generation, whether it's, your own children or the children in your community or whatever it may be, nieces, nephews, whatever, that it's important, it's important to invest in them, which I know we highly value our kids in this community, which is one of the things I really love about this congregation. But so it's very much this this next generation exhortation and like this encouragement to learn from what's happened in the last 40 years and be ready to take the land and ready to kind of the phrase we use sometimes, stand on the shoulders of their parents and go further as they enter the land. So, any other comments about Deuteronomy as a whole or anything like that before we actually jump into this portion?
Yes, I know it was talking about that apparently there's 70 new laws in Deuteronomy that weren't mentioned anywhere else. I thought that was interesting. I wonder if a lot of those, as you said, have to do with agricultural, once they came in, there's probably quite a few, I would imagine, with agriculture there.
Yeah, that's generally the understanding, is like that's why they're not really mentioned before. It's that they just kind of wait until it's time to go into the land.
Yeah, not much grows out there, right? In the desert, right? So,
Yeah.
But Yeshua, when he was fighting the enemy in the wilderness, he quoted 3 times from the Deuteronomy, the Shema, some of the most classic texts are found in this book.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's good. Okay.
I think of the blessings and the curses.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are powerful passages for sure. They're very, I really enjoy those passages actually. I'm excited for us to get there in a few weeks. But all right, well let's jump into our portion for this week. So we basically have Deuteronomy 1 through 3. The portion actually ends a little bit before the end of chapter 3, but we get most of it. So we start out, and I already mentioned we kind of have this time stamp that we're in the 40th year, in the 11th month, as he's starting to kind of give this retelling of the Torah, these final speeches. So he starts out in verse 9. The first kind of retelling we have is kind of a combination of when actually I don't think he names Jethro here, if I remember correctly. But kind of when he's with Jethro and his father-in-law, who kind of gives him this insight that's like, you can't do all this yourself. You can't judge all of these situations with all these people all by yourself. You have to have some people kind of over some of these smaller groups of people, and then you only deal with the biggest issues. So it kind of reiterates that in a sense, which also just it talks a lot about judgment, and talks about that judgment is ultimately the Lord's, and so there's kind of this process going through, right, that you would take it to one person. If they can't handle it, kind of goes up the ranks until it gets to Moses, who in his position as being like God to the people kind of represents God's judgment. and then it briefly talks about that they went to Horeb, which is Sinai, and then they go and explore the land. So this is one of those interesting passages where it feels it's a little bit different than when. Actually, sorry. Before I go to that, I want to back up 1 second. I skipped over something I wanted to say. So skip back. So pause on the scouts going in for a second. And go back to this. These people who are judging the situation. So in verse 13, it says, "Choose for yourself wise and discerning men, well known to your tribes, and I will appoint them as your heads." So Dennis Prager makes some interesting comments about this, that wisdom is emphasized here and what that means. And so he makes this point that Torah doesn't talk necessarily about leaders being good or being good people, though of course they should be, but their quote unquote goodness is not what's emphasized. It's their wisdom, and that good leaders need wisdom. And he gives lots of examples, which are really interesting. He talks a lot. So Dennis Prager has studied extensively, particularly communism in Russia, particularly, and so he uses that as his examples a lot. He uses communism as his example a lot, which is helpful. It makes a point, but it's like, and he makes this point when he talks about this good versus wise. Kind of paradigm that like there's a lot of good people think there's a lot of people who buy into communism because they think it's good, they think it's the right thing, they think it's going to help people, and really it's not. So they're lacking wisdom, and so he makes the argument that wisdom is more important than good intentions and more important than knowledge. He talks about even some of the best scholars who have all this knowledge are not necessarily wise, and how it's important to have wisdom, which made me think of the verse that immediately came to mind for me was James 1, in verses 5 and 6 talk about asking God for wisdom. It says, if anyone lacks wisdom, they should ask God, who will give generously without finding fault. And so yeah, again, it kind of is this point of like that wisdom is really important, like making good decisions and following the Lord. And then the rest of it, if you continue to read James 1 and you think about this, the importance of having wisdom as you're following the Lord, because it has this progression of all these things that will come on both ways, kind of, if you follow it, if you don't, that wisdom is really important. In these aspects. So that's kind of what I think of when I was thinking about this idea of wisdom. I was thinking about James 1 and this exhortation to ask God for it. Did you have something?
Just a little
Yeah.
right before that.
Mm-hmm.
Where the title there, says like bad report. But before they do that, I think it's really cool that Moses reminds them or speaks to them and says, Adonai your God, this is in verse 10, has multiplied you, and here you are today like the stars of the heaven in number. So, that's the Genesis 22 promise.
Right.
And so it's kind of like Moses is saying, here you are, you're Abraham's promise. Like, this is something the Lord promised, and here you are. And then on top of that, he says, may Adonai, the God of your fathers, increase you 1,000 times as many as you are. So that multiplying thing there, before he gets into like, this is how you guys, your fathers messed this up, he wants to remind them, I think just by mentioning that you guys have multiplied. You are Abraham's promise.
Right. Well, and even going back to Adam, like the very first instruction given to humanity is be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And so it's obviously important going back to Abraham, but it even goes back to Adam. Yeah, and he uses that language, like the stars in the heavens. So I think that is like an amazing way for Moses to launch this whole thing, is to first let them know, you're a fulfillment of a promise. Now let's keep this going. Right. Yeah, and it's very much this, even in that brief that brief statement that does, of course, connect back to the Abrahamic covenant and even back to Adam, is this, like, we talked about at the beginning, this idea of like this redemption that kind of even comes before obedience, because like we know, like they've been attacked already, they've been, they were in slavery, they were being hunted as they're coming out by Pharaoh's army, and yet they have been fruitful and multiplied. And even while they were in slavery, they were multiplying, right? That was the whole problem, is that Pharaoh's like, these people are becoming too numerous. Like, we can't, like, they're going to become too powerful. We can't have this. So that's, that's the initial threat even there, which is actually the fulfillment of what God instructed, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And so, it's just starting out this, like, even though you've been through all this hardship, you've been through all these difficult circumstances, the Lord has still been faithful and still multiplied you and still, is still bringing about these covenantal promises, and even about to bring a greater fullness of that as they're, right on the edge of the land, about to cross the Jordan into the land of Israel itself, which is that land piece of the Abrahamic covenant. We do start out with this, and then so that's So I just wanted to go back and pick up that little piece on wisdom as well. So then we do get into, we'll jump back to going where the scouts kind of go in the land. So let's see. So down in verse 22 and 23. He's recounting the people coming and saying, let's send some people in to check this out. And in 23 he says, this idea seemed good to me, which in Numbers it is more of it seemed good to the Lord language. But he says they took one man from each tribe and they went up. They bring back the fruit, and they say that the land is good. But then verse 26, and I'm going to read 26 through, well, maybe. I'm not going to read the whole thing. So they come back, and they wouldn't go up, and they were like, you brought us out of Egypt to destroy us. And I'm going to start in verse 29. And this is Moses speaking, of course. Then I said to you, don't tremble or be afraid of them. Adonai, your God, who goes before you, he himself will fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your own eyes. And in the wilderness, where you saw how Adonai, your God, carried you as a man carries his son everywhere you went until you came to this place. Yet for all this, you did not trust in Adonai, your God, the one who goes before you on the way to scout out a place for you to camp and to show you the way you should go, in fire by night and cloud by day. When Adonai heard the tone of your words, he was angry and swore an oath, saying, not one of these men of this evil generation will see the good land except that I swore to give to your father, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh, he will see it. Yet to him and his children I will give the land that he has dwelt on, because he has followed Adonai wholeheartedly. Adonai even angry with me on your account, saying, you will not enter there either. Joshua son of Nun, who stands before you, will enter here. Encourage him, for he will enable Israel to inherit it. And he goes on a little bit further, but I'll pause there, because we have a couple interesting things in this little section, right? Like he's reminding them that they didn't trust God, even though they have this fire by night and cloud by day to go before them and is showing them where to go throughout the wilderness. One of the things that sticks out to me is when it talks about how he was angry, how Adonai was angry. He heard the tone of your words and he was angry. And it's interesting that he first only mentions Caleb, and then a few verses later he mentions Joshua. He doesn't mention them together, which is always interesting. And all the commentaries bring that up, and they're like, we don't know why they're not both mentioned and why they're separated. It's funny. I don't know that it really matters, but I think it's funny that that's what everybody comments on. But anyway, this anger, we have these moments of anger, and we've seen these throughout the Torah. These moments where God is angry, and at times it's the responses that Moses kind of pleads for the people to kind of turn God's anger away from the people and things like that. But But these anger passages are sometimes the passages that people, use to say, he's this God of wrath, he's this angry God, he's this judgmental God, which of course he is the judge, and that's not a bad thing. This anger response really bothers people sometimes. But sometimes anger is the correct response, right? I think there is such a thing as righteous anger. There is certainly such a thing as unrighteous anger also. And I think as humans, we are maybe can be prone to that. But there is such a thing as righteous anger. And sometimes it's the only, the only right response. And Dennis Prager talks about the morality of anger is determined by its context. So if God is angry, it's probably a moral and righteous anger. I think that's pretty safe to say. But also, I think it's important to remember that there are multiple times throughout the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh that it says that God is slow to anger. Like even thinking in the 13 attributes at the end of Exodus, that he's slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. So if he's angry, he's actually been quite patient if he's gotten to the point of anger. And it means something. And so if you want to jot these down, I'm not going to look all of these up, but a couple of examples of the slow to anger passages would be Exodus 34:6, which is the 13 attributes of God passage. And then in Numbers 14:18, Psalm 86:15, and Joel 2:13 are all passages that talk about God being slow to anger. But it is interesting, and I'll open this up for some comments, that then as it continues on in verse 37, that it says that Adonai was angry even with me, meaning Moses, saying that you will not enter either, which is a little bit of a different telling. And Deuteronomy does also retell this differently later. But Moses was told he couldn't enter the land when he was told to speak to the rock to bring forth water, and he struck it instead and basically was like, you people, why aren't you people listening? Remember that whole episode. And so, but here it's saying it's because God was angry with him on the account of the people. So what do you think about this different telling of why Moses doesn't get to enter the land?
What's the passage?
In Deuteronomy?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's verse 37
Okay.
of chapter 1.
Oh, okay. Well, it's like, like this, New King James says, the Lord was also angry with me for your sakes. So if you look at what actually happened there, the people were guilty, and Moses was guilty.
Right.
So it's like they're both, in other words, if the people were being obedient, this never would have happened. If they weren't complaining, this never would have happened.
Sure.
So it's like the people are culpable. And so I see this verse is just kind of covering that aspect of it, as opposed to just turning all the blame on Moses alone.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a group thing here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And another issue is if the Lord didn't judge him for that, then that would be an example that it's okay to disobey the Lord when the people make you angry. So every parent, every leader could learn from that. Don't.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, it's interesting that it just is interesting that he doesn't seem to take responsibility for his own actions here. He blames it. It's all on the people, which I don't think is fully how he sees it, because later on, I don't remember what the verse is, but later on in Deuteronomy it mentions it again, and I think he understands his role, but it's just interesting the way it's worded here.
Well, I was thinking that he's getting closer and closer to where he won't, and it's becoming a reality right here. So this isn't all my fault,
Right? Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, for sure.
It could be.
What were you saying, Amanda?
I was looking for the verse, but I think I found it. No, what's the? I thought you said verse 30.
37.
Oh, okay.
Deuteronomy 1:37.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hopefully I can speak what I'm thinking. I don't see it. Of course, the Hebrew might be helpful, but Adonai was even angry with me on your account. I mean, it seems like we know previously it was because of the way he represented God to the people. So to me it could be read that he was angry with me because the way that I was presented to the people on your account. So I could see that sentence as also being in alignment with previous account, that it was because of the way God was angry with me because of the way you presented me, God, to the people. So I don't know. It seems like you could read that and join it with what we previously. That
Yeah.
it wasn't necessarily blaming the people. He was blaming himself because of I'm the leader of the people, you know.
Yeah.
So I've got responsibility to present God to the people. So if you don't exist, then he would not have been angry. I don't know if that was very clear.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. I mean, it definitely was this. I definitely think it's very much, it's highlighting the situation where, you know, Moses ultimately loses his right to enter the land was started because the people were grumbling and complaining, and the Lord is stepping in, and then, you know, Moses kind of got his own anger got the better of him as he was walking that out. Yeah.
So right before this, I thought it was interesting that he keeps saying, you did this, you did that, you did, you know, I mean, I know he's speaking to all of them, but they weren't necessarily the ones that did it.
Right.
You know, so perhaps in his thinking, it's still going that way, that,
Yeah.
as a whole.
Yeah. It is interesting because it's like, it is the next generation that he's speaking to. But he is still using this you, which is a very, like, so, I mean, it's something that you see even a lot in Jewish tradition and culture, is this corporate identity over time. Even thinking about, like, the Passover Seder, the language in the Seder as this retelling the Exodus story has like this we language, or this us. It's like the Lord brought us out of Egypt, which obviously no one who's alive today was brought out of Egypt, like literally. You know what I mean? You know, we weren't there, but it very much has this identification. So, which I don't know, maybe it goes back to some of this tradition but there's this very kind of, I don't know, cultural almost identity of we, which then comes out. You can see the reverse of that, the corporate you of this. But so yeah, and I mean, I think it's also like, I don't know that there's been enough time necessarily even for this generation to demonstrate that they have learned from their parents yet, because they haven't really been tested yet, you know. And so I think I think one perspective could be, I'm not, you know, it's hard to say, but could be, you know, he's speaking to them as if they still need to learn the lesson, because I don't know that it's been proven that they have learned it yet. But I don't know. That's just kind of my own, like, kind of processing through that. There's other perspectives, I'm sure. Yeah.
And it makes me think of this current emphasis on corporate, even generational repentance, that obviously I never owned slaves, but there are those who were calling out to us to repent for the sins of our forefathers, to cleanse the land. And so, I mean, Moses did so much that was so perfectly right, but he lost it on that very important point. And so, sort of taking the repentance for the whole community.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. I have like 15 minutes. So, I think, it's interesting to look at through, like I was mentioning, it's just interesting to look at some of the differences and how Moses is telling this versus how it was recorded initially, but I don't think it negates one or the other. I'm going to move on into chapter 2 a little bit, make a couple of comments about this. So this is kind of he's kind of just recounting some of the wilderness journeys, and something I think is really interesting are a couple of verses here. So in verse 4, so this is talking about them kind of traveling through. So in chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "Command the people, saying, you are about to cross into the territory of your relatives, the sons of Esau, who dwell in Seir. They will be afraid of you, so be very careful. Do not provoke them, for I will not give you any of their land, not even a footprint, because I have given the hill country of Seir to Esau as a possession." And he tells them, you're supposed to pay for everything you use while you're in their land, is basically what he's saying. And then I want to read one other verse, and then we can talk about it a little bit. Then down in verse 9, it says, this is an interesting one. Adonai said to me, "Do not harass Moab or engage them in battle, for I will not give you any of his land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the children of Lot for a possession." So both of these passages are basically telling us about essentially people who either are already or will become enemies of Israel, who have their own land, right? So he has given these portions of land, which is not Israel, other areas, to these other nations, essentially. And he instructs Israel. He's like, you can't have it. You can't take it away from them. The Lord has given it to them. So even back to this point, there's inheritance to other nations, and that is significant. And I think we could get into a whole political discussion about all the things going on today, and we are not going to take the time to do all of that. And also, it's Shabbat, and that sounds exhausting. So, but it plays a part in some of these tensions. But the reality is that God has given land to other people as well. So it's not this idea that Israel gets to have, whatever they want, which it's not what the text says, and I don't think is what we think. It's that he has given different nations to different places, and that's meant to be respected. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about nations that are not part of Abraham's family, but these are all part of Abraham's
exactly.
family.
Yeah.
So they're your kin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, like you said, we won't talk about today, but if everybody would recognize that they're kin, then things would be different.
Yes, that is true. It would be, but it gets complicated through history, of course. And then, of course, there's, it's a complicated situation. Because again, like I've said before, it would have been way easier if God would have just put a fence around Israel and saved it for them until they got there. But there's all these other people. So we have to deal with that.
Well, then there was the point that if he'd left them in there, the wild animals would have taken over. So
right, and so it's like,
they served a purpose.
Exactly, yes, and I'm being kind of silly when I say they would building a fence around and saving it for them. But because, and it talks about, I think it might be in 2 weeks. I can't remember now. I think it's in 2 weeks, the portion. It talks about this. It talks about, that actually God's going to bring blessing through the people that have lived there because of the crops that are there and the way they cultivate the land and things like that. And it's actually, they have to drive them out little by little because otherwise the land will basically eat them up. So it is actually important. But, humans make things complicated. That's my summary of history, is that there was a plan and then humans made it complicated. The end. Welcome to my history lesson. I don't know that Stan appreciates my summary. But is it not true?
Yeah.
He's like, oh, he's not going to comment.
The human element.
Yes. It's challenging. But there's so many facets to look at every situation. So I'm making a lot of generalizations and I'm being a little bit silly. But human interactions are challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that Apostle Paul says that us Gentiles become part of Abraham's family.
Mm-hmm.
don't become sons of Jacob or Israel, we don't become Jews.
Right.
We are a part of Abraham's family,
Yeah.
the promises
Yeah.
made and all that.
Yeah, which points back to even, you know, like, I think we've talked about it at some point, I don't know. Even looking back at Genesis when we have, you know, things are, you know, when God is establishing this Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lineage for the Jewish people, that he is still also taking care of, which we're seeing here, right? Even with Esau and with Moab, like that, which are the sons of Lot, like, so that, like, that these other parts of the family, so to speak, are taken care of, which again, kind of what works with our Jew-Gentile reality as well, right? We're just part of the same family, but we have different roles, and we're not all meant to be this one homogenous. Like, if all of the people were meant to become Jews, then we wouldn't have the God of all creation. We would have the God of the Jews, and that's not what he is. You know, he's the God of the whole earth, the God of all nations, the God of creation, all these things. And yes, he is the God of Israel, but that doesn't mean that all Gentiles become Jews, right? And it doesn't mean that Jews all become Gentile. So even though we become part of this family, we have different roles and different identities and different, you know, we're meant to maintain those things. So there's the, you know, so even back to this, anyway. So anyway, just going back to, these different, it is bringing up these different parts of the family, which again, they do ultimately become enemies of Israel, which again makes things more complicated because, you know, humans. But anyway, but he is specifically instructing them. He's like, I gave them these lands that you can't, you know, you don't get to take it from them. So just briefly, I don't have a lot to say necessarily about the rest. He's very much just kind of recounting the defeat of Sihon and Og, these battles that God really showed up for them. And then we get into the very last part of the portion. And I want to jump to something in the New Testament. That's why I'm kind of going a little bit more quickly, is because I want to jump to something else for just a couple minutes at the end here. But the last part of the portion, chapter 3, verses 12 through 22, gets into this reiterating that he gives the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh. They get land on the other side of the Jordan because they asked for it. But they're also required to fight for Israel, to go in. The men are required to go in and help the rest of Israel take the land. And we end this portion in verse 21-22. It says, I've commanded Joshua at this time, saying, your eyes have seen all that Adonai your God has done to these two kings, talking about Sihon and Og. Adonai will do the same to all the kingdoms you are about to cross into. You must not fear them, for it is Adonai who fights for you. So this theme of Adonai who fights for you comes up several times in the Torah and through Deuteronomy. But it is interesting that we definitely see, we're set up to see that Joshua is going to be a different kind of leader. Like, he's meant for a different purpose than Moses was. Like, right, he's not going to lead the same way that Moses does. He's very much a military leader. He's going to go in for these conquests. So Moses is exhorting him, who is one of the only other people who has seen the entire wilderness experience and is going to go into the land. So he's, you know, is going to have this whole picture as they're going, but exhorting him to remember how that the Lord has shown up as he said he would in these battles and to overtake these people, and that he'll continue to do that because the Lord knows that they're going into a really intimidating situation, right? There's lots of, you know, and that's the report that came back from the land too, right? Is there's all these big strong people that we have to overtake, and we don't feel big and strong. So how are we going to do this? But the Lord has shown himself that he will show up and fight for them. So we kind of end this portion on that note of exhortation. So really quick, in our last few minutes, I want to jump to Acts. So this is actually one of my favorite parts of Acts. I really like Acts. And we don't have time to read through the whole thing, but so this section actually starts this whole story kind of starts in chapter 6, verse 8. So it's talking about Stephen, who is regarded as like the first martyr of faith in Yeshua. And it kind of sets him up that, so they're those who are against Yeshua are coming after him. And so chapter 7 is one of my favorite passages, I think, in the New Testament, honestly. And it's Stephen's speech, and he's speaking to the high priest, and he ultimately is going to be stoned. But he's giving a summary of the Torah and the Tanakh. He talks about coming out of, he talks about Abraham, he talks about Moses, he talks about the wilderness, he talks about all these things. Like I said, we don't have time to read it all right now, but I would encourage you to go back and read it. It's a really good summary of the Torah. But towards the end, it talks about, okay, so I'm going to read a few verses. So in verse 51, Acts 7:51, he says, this is the end of his speech. He says, "O you stiff-necked people, you uncircumcised of heart and ears, you always resist the Ruach HaKodesh, just as your fathers did, you do as well. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed the ones who foretold the coming of the righteous one. Now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You who received the Torah by direction of angels and did not keep it." When they heard these things, they became enraged and began gnashing their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Ruach HaKodesh, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Yeshua standing at the right hand of God. And he said, "Look, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But they covered their ears, and crying out with a loud voice, they rushed at him with one impulse. Driving him out of the city, they began stoning him, and the witnesses laid down their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul. They went on stoning Stephen, and as he was calling out, "Lord Yeshua, receive my spirit." Then he fell on his knees and cried out with a loud voice, "Do not hold this sin against them." And after this, he died. And in the beginning, I'm just going to read these first couple verses of chapter 8. Now Saul was in agreement with Stephen's execution. On that day, a great persecution arose against Messiah's communities in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the emissaries. Some devout men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul was destroying Messiah's community, entering house after house and dragging off men and women. He was throwing them into prison. So a couple of things I want to say about this. So at verses 51 through 53 is the very end of Stephen's speech, and basically this is kind of the Emma translation / summary of this. He's basically saying, you haven't learned anything. You're just like the people in the wilderness, all the generations that have come after this. Which of the prophets have your fathers not persecuted? You receive the Torah and you're not keeping it. So even at this point, and right, like he's being persecuted for his belief in Yeshua, and yet he's retelling the Torah, and he's saying, all of you are nothing. You're no better than all of those who came before you. You haven't learned the lesson like you were supposed to. And then this is also our introduction to Saul, who is Paul. And we see him persecuting believers, and then of course we know it's not long after, it's another chapter later when he has this dramatic encounter with Yeshua and becomes a follower, of course. But this is our introduction to him. And so I just pointed this out to just say, we are, as another reminder to us, like we do have a choice in our how we follow the Lord and in our obedience, and we can learn the lessons from those who came before us. We don't have to be like these people that Stephen is saying, you haven't learned anything. You're just like they were. And of course, he's speaking to a very specific group of people. He's not speaking to all Jewish people. He's not speaking to everyone there, but he's speaking to the specific people who have rejected Yeshua, and he's pointing out that they're just like those who persecuted the prophets and all of those things. So anyway, like I said, I really like Stephen's speech on this summary of the Torah. I think it's a really cool, that, you know, the end of his life is that he's talking about the faithfulness of God to the people of Israel. And basically, I don't know, I always feel some of the conviction as I read the end of it too, of just like, you know, have I learned the lessons that God wants me to learn? Have I learned from those that have come before me? Or am I repeating the sin and error of their ways? So I'm excited to continue our journey through Deuteronomy in the next couple of months, which also means that we're getting closer to the fall holidays and all of those celebrations, which are so fun. Kale sent an email with dates of the holiday services for the fall. So if you haven't seen that email, check your email. Dates for all of the fall holiday services have been sent, so mark your calendars. Get ready to celebrate, and we have a bar mitzvah in service today, so be praying for the Anderson family and enjoy celebrating Eli, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Okay.